The morning Myrtle Leland was told, she had 3 days to choose between marrying a man she did not love and leaving town with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was standing in the middle of a dusty Kansas street in the year 1878, watching a stranger pull a boy out of the path of a runaway horse. The stranger moved so fast that it barely registered as something real. One moment the boy was there, frozen in the churned-up dirt, and the next moment a pair of strong arms had scooped him sideways into the safety of the boardwalk, and the horse thundered past with its empty saddle slapping against its flanks. The boy cried. The stranger set him down, checked him over with quick and careful hands, said something low that made the boy laugh through his tears, and then stood up and dusted his hat against his thigh. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved out of red rock by a patient river. He wore a plain brown duster and boots that had seen real miles, and when he turned and caught Myrtle staring at him from the opposite side of the street, he did not smirk or tip his hat in that lazy way men sometimes did when they wanted a woman to know they had noticed her noticing them. He just held her gaze for one steady second, nodded once, and walked into the general store. Myrtle stood there a moment longer than she should have. "Myrtle," her aunt's voice came from behind her, clipped and sharp as a whip crack. "Come inside before you embarrass yourself." She turned and followed Eleanor Leland back through the door of the dry goods shop, where bolts of calico sat in neat rows and the air smelled of cedar and old paper. Her aunt settled behind the counter and looked at her with the expression she reserved for things that had already been decided. "Silas Cutter will be expecting your answer by Friday," Eleanor said. "He has been more than patient." "He has been patient for 3 weeks," Myrtle said, keeping her voice even. "That is not a remarkable length of time to wait before expecting a woman to agree to spend her entire life with him." "You have no money," Eleanor said, as though that were the complete argument, as though those 3 words contained all the logic any reasonable person would ever need. "You have no land. Your father is gone. The house is sold. What exactly do you believe you are waiting for?" Myrtle did not answer because there was no answer that Eleanor would accept. She was 23 years old and had been living in her aunt's back room since her father died of fever the previous spring, and every day since then had felt like a debt she was accumulating without any means of repayment. Eleanor was not unkind in the way that cruel people were unkind. She was practical. She believed in arrangements and outcomes and sensible futures. She had arranged her own sensible future at 19 by marrying a man who owned a dry goods store in Colton, Kansas, and she had run that store competently and without complaint for 24 years. She could not understand why Myrtle, who had far fewer options, was making things so difficult. Silas Cutter owned the largest cattle operation within 40 miles of Colton. He was 41 years old, which was not ancient, but he had the personality of someone who had never once been told he was wrong about anything and had decided to move through the world accordingly. He had offered for Myrtle because she was pretty and because he wanted a wife to manage his household, in roughly that order. He had not asked her what she thought about much of anything, and when she had tried twice to steer their conversations toward subjects she actually cared about, he had listened for 30 seconds and then redirected to the price of beef or the incompetence of his ranch hands. Myrtle was not naive. She understood that the world of 1878 did not offer women in her position a wide selection of paths. She had no money and no property and no profession, and the territory around Colton was not the kind of place where a woman walked in and started something of her own without a great deal more capital and a great deal more tolerance for danger than she presently had. She knew all of this. She had thought about it in her narrow back room every night for months. But she was also not ready to close the door on the possibility that her life could be something more than a sensible arrangement. She went about the rest of that Thursday without seeing the stranger again, but she thought about him more than was reasonable. She thought about the speed of his reaction and the gentleness of his hands, and the way he had looked at her without performance, without calculation, just directly, the way a person looked at another person when they were not pretending to be anything other than what they were. Friday came fast. Sela's cutter arrived at the dry goods store at 10 in the morning, which was when Alina had told him to come, and he stood in the center of the shop with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes already containing the assumption that everything was about to go the way he expected. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with sandy hair going silver at the temples and a mouth that did not often lift at the corners without a reason he had calculated first. "Well," he said, looking at Myrtle. "Mr. Cutter," she said. "Sela's," he said, with the mild impatience of a man correcting a child. Alina was hovering near the back, pretending to organize shelving that was already perfectly organized. Myrtle looked at Sela's cutter and tried, one final time, to find some feeling in herself that was not simply resignation. She tried to imagine the next 20 years. She tried to imagine sitting across a supper table from him every evening and sleeping in a room beside his and raising whatever children came of it and watching the territory change around them while she stayed the same. She tried to make it feel like something she was choosing rather than something that was happening to her like weather. She could not do it. "I appreciate your offer," she said. "I want you to know that I mean that sincerely, but I cannot accept it." The room went very still. Sela's cutter looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was not hurt, which might have made it easier to bear. It was something more like offense. The offense of a man who had expected a particular outcome and had been denied it and did not understand by what authority. "Is that your final word?" he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hat back on and looked at Alina. "You ought to have a longer conversation with your niece about her circumstances," he said, and walked out. Alina waited until the door closed. Then she turned to Myrtle with an expression that was more exhausted than angry, which was somehow worse. "You have 2 weeks," Alina said. "I am not turning you out in the cold, Myrtle. I am not that kind of woman. But you need to find a plan by the end of the month because I cannot continue to feed and house someone who is not working towards something." "I understand," Myrtle said. "I will find work." "In Colton," Alina said. "Where exactly?" It was a fair question. Colton was not a large town. It had a general store, a saloon, a livery, a small hotel, a schoolhouse, a church, and the handful of establishments that clustered around the cattle trade. It was not the kind of town that had many positions for women who were not already wives or teachers, and the schoolteacher's position was occupied by a man named Herbert Finch who showed no intention of leaving. But Myrtle had already thought of something. The hotel was owned by a woman named Clara Voss, who had come to Kansas from Ohio after her husband died in a farming accident, and had built the Voss Hotel with the insurance money and her own considerable stubbornness. Clara was 48 and direct and fair, and she had told Myrtle once, in passing, that she could use help at the front desk and in the kitchen when the cattle drives pushed through and filled every room. It was not a permanent position, and it would not pay much, but it was something. Myrtle went to Clara Voss that same afternoon and asked. Clara looked at her across the hotel desk, sizing her up the way a woman who had built something out of nothing looked at another woman to see what she was made of. "You can cook?" Clara asked. "Well enough," Myrtle said. "You can handle a difficult guest without losing your composure." "I handled Sela's cutter this morning and did not lose my composure." Clara's mouth turned up at one corner. "I heard about that," she said. "All right, you start Monday. I pay in room and board plus $1 a week. It is not much." "It is enough," Myrtle said. She walked back to her aunt's house feeling something she had not felt in a long time. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like ground beneath her feet. She moved into the Voss Hotel on Sunday, into a small room on the second floor that smelled of lye soap and had a window that looked out onto the main street. The room was barely larger than a wardrobe, but it was hers, and she spent the evening arranging her few things on the narrow shelf above the bed, and sitting in the window watching the street go quiet as the sun went down. And she felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has made a hard choice and knows, in the honest part of themselves, that it was the right one. The stranger came back on Tuesday. He rode into Colton in the early afternoon on a deep-chested roan horse with a traveling pack lashed behind the saddle, and Myrtle saw him from the hotel window before he had even dismounted. She watched him tie the horse at the rail outside the hotel and come through the front door, and when she turned from the window and came downstairs to take her place at the front desk, she found him already standing there with his hat in his hand. He was even taller than she remembered, and the face she had watched from across the street was, at close range, more interesting than handsome, though it was that too. There was a quality to it of a person who had thought hard about things and had not always liked the conclusions he had reached. "I am looking for a room," he said, "if you have one." "We have 2 rooms available," she said, finding her professional footing. 50 cents a night or $2.50 for the week. That includes breakfast." "I will take the week," he said. He reached into his coat and produced the money without hesitation, setting it on the counter in neat coins. She counted it. "Name for the register." "Jonas Hayes," he said. She wrote it down. The ink was still wet when she looked up and found him watching her with those direct, unhurried eyes. "You were across the street on Thursday," he said, "when the horse came through." "I was," she said. "The boy was fine," Jonas said, "in case you wondered." "I did wonder," she said. "I am glad to hear it." Something shifted in the air between them, something small and electric, like the feeling before a storm when the pressure changes and every hair on your arms lifts by a fraction. Myrtle had not felt that particular thing before, and she recognized it the way you recognized something you had only ever read about in books, with a mixture of certainty and disbelief. Then a guest came in from the dining room asking about the price of a bath, and the moment passed, and Jonas took his key and went up the stairs, and Myrtle spent the rest of the afternoon telling herself that a man's eyes were just eyes and not a thing worth rearranging your entire chest about. She did not entirely succeed. Jonas Hayes, she learned over the following days, was from Texas by way of Colorado, and he was 30 years old, and he had come to Kansas looking for work. Not ranch work, though he could do that. He had a trade. He was a carpenter, and he had heard through the chain of letters and rumors that passed between towns on the frontier that a man in Colton named Edward Park wanted to build a new grain storage facility before the fall harvest came in. He was correct. Edward Park did want exactly that, and he hired Jonas on Wednesday morning after a short and practical conversation in which Jonas showed him a sample of joinery he had brought in his pack, and Park ran his thumb along the dovetail joint and said, "All right then," in the voice of a man who recognized good work. Jonas told Myrtle this on Wednesday evening when she brought the supper board to the small dining room off the hotel lobby. Most of the other guests took their plates and retired, but Jonas lingered over his coffee, and Myrtle lingered too, tidying things that did not need tidying, and they talked. He talked the way she liked people to talk, without filling every space with sound, letting the quiet sit comfortably between sentences instead of rushing to cover it up. He asked her questions and actually listened to the answers. When she told him about her father, about the house being sold, about the months in her aunt's back room and the decision she had made about Sela's cutter, he did not give her the expression men sometimes gave women when they did something impractical and then had to be rescued from the consequences. He gave her the expression of someone who understood exactly the kind of courage it took to refuse a comfortable disaster. "That was brave," he said simply. "Some would call it foolish," she said. "They might," he said. "I call it brave." She looked down at the coffee cup she was straightening and straightening and straightening. "What made you take up carpentry?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My father built things," he said. "He was not a good man in most respects, but he was a good builder. I figured if I was going to carry anything of his forward, it might as well be that." She looked up. There was something in the way he said it that told her it had cost him something to say it, and that he had said it anyway because he had decided she was worth saying true things to. "I think that is a generous way to think about it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You are easy to talk to," he said, as though this surprised him. "So are you," she said. It became a ritual, those evening conversations. She would finish the clearing and he would sit with his coffee, and sometimes they would talk for an hour and sometimes only for 20 minutes, but the quality of those 20 minutes was such that she found herself thinking about them during the day while she was making beds or carrying linens or organizing the front desk. Clara Voss noticed. Clara noticed most things. She came to Myrtle on Friday of the second week, while they were working together in the kitchen before breakfast service, and she said without preamble, "The carpenter is a good man." "I believe he is," Myrtle said carefully. "He asks about you," Clara said. "When you are not in the room, he asks how long you have worked here and whether you are planning to stay in Colton." Myrtle set down the bread pan. "He does." "He does," Clara said, with the brevity of a woman delivering information and letting the receiver do what she would with it. Myrtle picked up the bread pan again. That Sunday was the first time Jonas asked her to walk with him. He did it in the straightforward manner that seemed to be characteristic of him, coming to her at the front desk in the late afternoon, when the hotel was quiet, and asking if she might like to take a walk along the creek south of town before supper. And she said yes before she had quite thought it through, which she later decided was the most honest thing she could have done. The creek was called Cutter's Creek, which she found mildly irritating under the circumstances, but the walk itself was the kind of thing that settled into your memory before it was even finished, the way certain afternoons seemed to know while they were still happening that they would matter. The light was long and amber, and the cottonwoods along the bank were turning, and Jonas walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and talked about Colorado and the mountains, and the particular quality of silence at altitude that he had never been able to find anywhere else. And she told him about growing up in a small Missouri town and coming west with her father when she was 15, and the way the Kansas sky had felt like an affront at first, too large, too present, nothing between you and it. "Did you get used to it?" he asked. "I came to love it," she said, "which is not the same thing." He turned to look at her. "No," he said, "it is not." They walked back as the light was fading, and when they reached the hotel door he stopped and looked at her with that quality she was coming to recognize as specifically his, that directness without presumption. "I would like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said. October came in with a cold wind that stripped the last of the cottonwood leaves from the trees and drove them rattling down the main street of Colton like small, desperate things looking for somewhere to land. Jonas had been in town for 3 weeks. He worked 6 days a week on the park grain storage building and spent his evenings in the hotel dining room or walking the town in the late light, and on Sundays he and Myrtle walked. The walks grew longer. They began to talk about things that were not background, not histories. They talked about the country and what it was becoming. They talked about the cattle trade and the damage it was doing to the grassland. Jonas had views on things. He had read widely, which surprised some people who had assumed that a man who worked with his hands did not also work with his mind, though Myrtle was not surprised by it at all. She had views too, and she expressed them, and he listened to them with the genuine attention of someone who expected to be challenged and found it worthwhile. One Sunday in late October they sat on the bank of Cutter's Creek with their boots nearly touching and the cold wind coming across the water, and Jonas said something that Myrtle had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to hear. "I have been thinking about what happens when the park building is done," he said. "When will that be?" She asked, keeping her voice steady. 6 weeks, maybe 8, he said. "There are complications with the timber delivery which is pushing the schedule." "And after it is done?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "That depends on several things," he said. He turned to look at her then, and the directness in his eyes was now something more than directness. It was something that had weight and intention and the careful nerve of a person who has decided to say what they mean. "It depends on whether there is a reason to stay in Colton." Her heart did a thing she had no words for. "There might be," she said. The quiet between them was not empty. It was the kind of quiet that was full to the edges with everything they had not yet said. He reached out and covered her hand with his, and the warmth of it went through her like a current. She turned her hand over under his and their fingers settled together, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and the creek moved past them, and the sky went from amber to rose to purple, and the first stars came out. And Myrtle Leland sat on the bank of a creek in Kansas in the autumn of 1878 and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the ground under her feet was not just ground. It was the beginning of something. It was Clara Voss who first said the word out loud that Myrtle had been circling. "He is in love with you," Clara said one morning in November, with the directness of a woman who had long since decided that the world worked better when people said what they meant. "We have known each other for 5 weeks," Myrtle said. "How long did it take you to know?" Clara said, and it was not really a question. Myrtle did not answer, which was an answer. She thought about Jonas in the spaces of her days. She thought about the way he moved, unhurried and precise, the same quality in everything he did, whether it was working a joint or pouring coffee. She thought about his laugh, which was quiet but real, the laugh of a man who found things genuinely funny rather than performing amusement for an audience. She thought about the way he looked at her, as though she were not a problem to be solved or an arrangement to be made, but a person, complete and specific and worth knowing. She had not known many men who looked at women that way. She had not known she was waiting for it until she found it. Things came to their second complication on a cold Wednesday in November, when Silas Cutter walked into the Voss Hotel in the early afternoon. He was not there to make trouble, exactly. He was there because he had received news that changed things. His widowed sister in Abilene had died and left him her house and her savings, neither of which he needed, but the paperwork required a trip to Abilene, and he needed someone to manage the hotel's accounting while Clara Voss, who had been his sister's childhood friend, attended the services. He saw Myrtle behind the front desk and he stopped. "Miss Leland," he said. "Mr. Cutter," she said. They looked at each other with the particular awkwardness of two people who had had an important and uncomfortable conversation and were now navigating what it meant in ordinary space. He did not say anything cruel. That was not his way. He was not a cruel man. She had never thought that. He was simply a man who had built his understanding of the world around the certainty of his own importance, and that certainty made him incapable, in small and significant ways, of actually seeing the people around him as complete individuals with their own inner lives. "I hear you have made a life for yourself here," he said. There was something in it that was almost, not quite, but almost like respect. "I am trying to," she said. He nodded. He did his business with Clara and left, and Myrtle stood at the desk for a moment afterward with her hands flat on the wood and thought about the word he had used, made. As though a life were something a person built rather than something that happened to them. She decided she liked that word. Jonas came in for supper that evening and she told him about the encounter. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without rushing to respond. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I think I am more than all right." He studied her face in that way he had, as though he were reading something carefully and wanting to get it right. "Good," he said. "Jonas," she said. "Yes. I am glad you stayed in Colton." The expression that moved across his face was something she wanted to draw if she had known how to draw. It was not simple happiness, though it was that. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down in the right place. "So am I," he said. He reached across the table and she took his hand, and Clara Voss came through the kitchen door and saw them and went straight back through without a word, though Myrtle heard, just before the door swung shut, what was unmistakably a satisfied sound. The first time Jonas kissed her was 2 days later, on a Thursday evening after supper, when they were standing in the small side hallway that led from the dining room to the hotel lobby. It was not dramatic. Nothing about Jonas was dramatic in the theatrical sense. He simply stopped walking and turned to face her in the narrow space and looked at her with the question visible in his eyes without being spoken, and she stepped forward rather than back, and he kissed her in the way that some rare things are done, simply, completely, without any distance between the intention and the act. She stood there afterward with her hand on his chest and his hand at her jaw, and they were both very quiet. "All right," she said softly. He exhaled, and it was the exhale of a man who had been nervous and is no longer, and she loved him for being nervous, for not having taken it for granted. "All right," he said. November deepened. The Park Grain storage building rose from its foundation in stages, and Jonas came home each evening smelling of sawdust and pine resin and the cold air that had been moving down from the northwest. And Myrtle learned the particular satisfaction of having something to come home to, someone to talk to over supper, a presence that made a place feel like a place instead of just a space you occupied. They talked about the future in the careful way that people do when they are trying not to press too hard on something they want very much. He talked about possibly setting up a proper carpentry shop in Colton, if the demand was there. She talked about whether the hotel management was something she might develop into a more permanent arrangement with Clara. They talked around the larger thing, the way you circle a fire to feel the warmth before you commit to sitting down directly beside it. The complication that came in early December was not the one Myrtle had been expecting. It came in the form of a letter. Her mother's brother, a man named Gerald Whitmore who had money and property in St. Louis, and had always disapproved of the Leland family's westward migration, wrote to say that he had become aware of her circumstances, and that he was prepared to offer her a home in St. Louis under one condition. She would come to live with the Whitmore family, she would be provided for, and she would in due course be introduced to men of standing and means. The condition was that she come at once, before the winter made travel impractical, and that she come alone, leaving behind whatever arrangements she had made in whatever frontier town she had found herself in. He did not know about Jonas. He did not need to. The letter contained its own understanding of what a woman in her position should do, and it did not include the pursuit of happiness in a small Kansas town, with a carpenter she had known for 6 weeks. Myrtle Leland brought the letter to the hotel in person because Myrtle believed in delivering important things in person where she could observe the reaction. Myrtle read it at the front desk while Myrtle stood across from her. "This is a very good offer," Myrtle said. "I can see that," Myrtle said. "Gerald Whitmore is a man of considerable resources. He will provide for you well." "In exchange for my compliance," Myrtle said. Myrtle sighed. "You are going to turn it down," she said. It was not a question. Myrtle had known Myrtle for 23 years, and she knew the particular set of her jaw. "I have not decided yet," Myrtle said, which was true in that she had not yet decided how to explain her decision to herself in a way that felt fully resolved. Myrtle looked at her steadily. "The carpenter," she said. "He has a name," Myrtle said. "I know his name," Myrtle said. "I also know that he has been in town for 6 weeks and has no property and no settled income and cannot offer you the kind of security that Gerald Whitmore can." "Gerald Whitmore cannot offer me the kind of life that I want," Myrtle said. Myrtle was quiet for a moment. Then she said something Myrtle had not expected. "I know," she said. "I am not saying you are wrong about what you want. I am saying that wanting is not always enough. I am saying that the world does not always allow a woman to have both safety and the life she wants, and I do not want you to look back in 10 years and find you have chosen the harder road unnecessarily." It was the most honest thing Myrtle had said to her in years, and Myrtle sat with it. She sat with it all day. She worked the front desk and made the beds and carried the linens and thought about St. Louis, which she had never been to but could imagine, the brick buildings and the gas-lit streets, and the salons where women in good dresses talked about things that had nothing to do with survival. She thought about security. She thought about what it meant to have it and what it cost. And then Jonas came in from the site at 5 in the evening, covered in sawdust and cold air, and he stopped at the desk and smiled at her in that way he had, that unhurried, unperforming, entirely genuine way, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing, not safety. The thing underneath safety, the thing safety was meant to protect. The actual life, the warmth of it, the particular irreplaceable warmth of being known. She asked him to walk with her after supper. They walked in the cold dark, not to the creek, just around the town, past the lit windows and the smoke rising from chimneys, and she told him about the letter. She told him all of it. She watched his face in the faint light and saw him listen and process and understand. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I am going to refuse it," she said, "but I wanted to tell you first. I want you to understand that I am not refusing it because of you. I am refusing it because it is not the life I want regardless of anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand the distinction," he said. "Do you understand why I am making it?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "You need to know that your choice is yours, not a consequence of someone else." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "That is exactly right," she said. He looked at her. "Myrtle," he said, and the way he said her name, not as a preamble to something else but as the thing itself, as though saying her name were its own complete sentence, made something settle deep in her chest. "I want to be honest with you about something." "All right," she said. "I have been careful," he said, "not to press you or make you feel that anything here depends on what you decide about that letter, because it does not and it should not. But I am also going to be honest and tell you that what has happened between us in these past weeks is not something I take lightly. I am not a man who moves through things lightly. I do not know exactly what you want or what you see for your future, and I am not asking you to tell me tonight. But I am asking you to know that whatever you are building here, you are not building it alone." The cold air moved between the buildings and down the street and lifted her hair, and she stood in the dark in Colton, Kansas, in December of 1878, and looked at Jonas Hayes, and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was looking at the rest of her life. "I know I am not alone," she said. She wrote the letter to Gerald Whitmore the next morning. She was polite and she was clear. She thanked him for his generosity and told him that she had made her life in Kansas and intended to continue it there. She did not explain further because she did not owe an explanation. Alina came by the hotel 2 days after the letter was sent and found Myrtle at the front desk looking entirely settled in herself. And Alina looked at her for a long moment and then sat down in the chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap. "You are going to be all right," Alina said, and it was not a prediction. It was a recognition. "Yes," Myrtle said, "I am." "Tell me about this man," Alina said. Myrtle told her. She watched Alina listen with the careful attention of a woman who had spent a long time making practical assessments of the world and was now making one and finding that the results were better than she had expected. "He is a serious man," Alina said when Myrtle finished. "He is," Myrtle said. "Good," Alina said. She stood up, straightened her coat, and said, "Your father would have liked him." And then she walked out before Myrtle could respond to that, which was probably deliberate. Myrtle sat very still for a moment, feeling the gift of those words. Christmas came to Colton in a light snowfall that dusted the rooftops and filled the ruts in the main street and turned the cottonwoods along the creek into something out of an illustration in a children's book. The whole town had a quality of softness that its usual dry-dust summer self did not possess, and Myrtle found that she liked Colton in the winter the same way she liked it in the summer, which was to say deeply, and with a sense of ownership that had nothing to do with property. Jonas brought her a gift on Christmas Eve. It was a small wooden box, made of cherry wood with a fitted lid and a small carved design on the surface, a single cottonwood leaf, its veins so delicately cut that they were nearly translucent in the lamplight. He had made it himself in the evenings after the park work was done. She held it in both hands and looked at the leaf and felt the precision of the craft, the time and care that had gone into something so small. "It is beautiful," she said. "The lid fits true," he said, which was, she understood, the thing he was most proud of. She opened it. Inside, sitting on the bare, polished wood, was a small note folded twice. She looked at him and he nodded, and she opened it. In his careful, even handwriting it said, "I intend to ask you a question. I'm not asking it tonight because I want you to have time and space to think about it without pressure. But I want you to know that I intend to ask it so that when I do, You will know that it is something I have thought about for a long time and not said lightly." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in the box and closed the lid. "All right," she said. He was watching her with that nervous quality she had come to love. All right meaning I will think about it," she said, and then, because she could not help it, she smiled, and he saw the smile and the nervousness in him dissolved into something much warmer. "You are going to make me wait," he said. "I'm letting you have your moment," she said. "You planned it. I'm respecting the plan." He laughed, the real quiet laugh, and she leaned forward and kissed him on the cheek, and outside the snow came down soft and steady, and the lamplight made everything amber and close. January was cold and clear. The Park Grain building was finished in the second week, and Edward Park stood in front of it on the day Jonas drove the last nail and shook his hand, and said it was the finest piece of construction work he had seen in 20 years of building in Kansas. And Myrtle heard this from Clara, who had heard it from the man who ran the feed store across the street. And she felt a pride in Jonas that was not possessive, but was rather the clean, specific pleasure of seeing someone you admire recognized for exactly what they are. Other work appeared almost immediately. A family named Brennan, who had a homestead 6 miles east of town, needed a new barn frame after their old one collapsed under the weight of a heavy ice storm, and Jonas went out to assess the job and came back with a contract and a gleam in his eye that told her he had already begun the building in his mind. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in late January, they were sitting in the small parlor off the hotel lobby that Clara sometimes opened to guests in the evenings, a fire going in the small iron stove, and the sound of the wind outside making the warmth inside feel like something earned, and Jonas set down his coffee cup and looked at her with complete attention. "Myrtle," he said. She set down her own cup. "I told you in December that I intended to ask you a question," he said. "I have been thinking about how to ask it in a way that is honest and not simply pretty, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve pretty, though I will try to provide both." She looked at him and her hands were very still in her lap. "I love you," he said. "I want to say that first and plainly. I have loved you since some time in October, and I was not certain about the right moment to say so, but I am certain now, and I do not want to leave it unsaid any longer. I love you, and I would like to know if you will marry me." The fire crackled in the stove. Somewhere outside a horse moved along the frozen street. Myrtle thought about the morning she had stood in the middle of a dusty Kansas street and watched this man pull a child out of the path of a runaway horse. She thought about Alina telling her she had 2 weeks to find a plan. She thought about the note in the cherry wood box. She thought about all the small moments that were not small, the creek bank and the cold evenings and the easy quiet of 2 people who had found in each other something they had not known to look for. "I love you," she said. "And yes, yes, I will." He exhaled, and again it was that exhale of a man setting something down, and he reached across and took both her hands in his, and they sat that way for a long time with the fire going and the wind outside, and the whole frozen Kansas winter pressing against the walls of the room that contained them, warm and bright and resolved. They told Clara first, because Clara had essentially been the third party in the whole development and deserved to be told first. Clara looked at them both and said, "About time," and then went to the kitchen and came back with a bottle of wine she had been keeping for a significant occasion. They told Alina the following day. Alina sat very straight in her chair and listened and then said good with the conviction of someone who had revised their assessment of a situation and was not embarrassed to admit it. "He is building a life," Alina said. "I can see that." "So am I," Myrtle said. Alina reached across and patted her hand. "Yes," she said, "you are." The wedding was planned for March, which gave Jonas 2 months to finish the Brennan barn and to begin making arrangements for the carpentry shop he had been thinking about since November. He had identified a building on the south end of the main street, a narrow storefront that had been a harness repair shop before the man who ran it had moved on, and the owner was willing to let it on a monthly arrangement with the option to purchase. He showed it to Myrtle on a Saturday in February, walking her down the frozen street with his hand at her back, pointing out the solid walls and the good light through the north window, and the space in the back where a workshop could be organized. She walked through it and looked at everything carefully. "The front could be a showroom," she said. "You could display pieces." "That is what I was thinking," he said. "And the workshop needs ventilation," she said, pointing at the back wall. "A proper vent above the work area." He looked at where she was pointing and nodded slowly. "You are right," he said. She turned to him. "I think it is a very good space." The expression on his face was the one she loved, the particular mix of certainty and wonder of a man who keeps finding that the person he is with is exactly the person he thought they were, and is moved by it every time. They signed the monthly arrangement on the building the following week, and Jonas began organizing the workshop in the evenings after the Brennan barn work during the days. He built a proper workbench from white oak, mortised and pegged in the old way, solid as anything that would ever stand on it, and he built the shelves and the display cases in the front room with the same care. Myrtle helped. She was practical with her hands in the way that women who had run households often were, and she understood organization and display in ways that Jonas, who thought primarily in terms of construction and craft, was glad to defer to. They worked well together in the evenings, which she took as a good sign, because how two people work together in practical space, in the unglamorous work of making something, was more predictive of a marriage than any amount of romantic evening. Clara, watching all of this, said, "I am going to lose my best desk worker," and then immediately offered to host the wedding supper at the hotel. March came in hard, with a late storm that dropped 8 inches of snow, and then cleared overnight to a sky of such brilliant blue that it hurt to look at it. 3 days later the street was running with snowmelt, and the air had the smell of something waking up. They married on the 15th of March, 1879, in the Colton church on a Saturday morning when the light came through the east windows in long gold shafts, and settled on the plain wooden pews and the plain wooden floor, and made everything look like something out of a different and better world. The Reverend Thomas Hale, who had married more homesteaders and ranchers and traveling people than he could count, looked at Jonas and Myrtle standing before him, and said afterwards to his wife that he could not remember in recent memory 2 people who appeared so absolutely certain of what they were doing. Jonas wore his best coat and a clean white shirt, and had his dark hair combed back, and he stood at the altar with the stillness of a man who had found his bearing, and was not afraid of it. Myrtle wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from a pale blue wool that Clara had been saving in the back of her own wardrobe since before Myrtle had arrived in Colton, claiming later that she had simply never found the right occasion for it, and that this was clearly what it had been waiting for. When Myrtle walked down the short aisle on the arm of Clara Voss, because there was no one else, Jonas watched her come and she watched him watch her, and something passed between them that had no language, that existed only in the register of things known completely. "I do," she said when the time came, looking at him. "I do," he said, looking at her. Reverend Hale smiled and said, "Then you are." And outside the church the small gathering of Colton residents who had come to watch gave a cheer, and Myrtle Leland pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, and Clara Voss did not press anything to her mouth because she was already smiling too hard to need it. The wedding supper at the Voss Hotel was something Colton talked about for a season. Clara had cooked for 2 days, and the dining room was lit with extra oil lamps and filled with voices, and Jonas and Myrtle sat at the center of it all and ate and talked and laughed and held hands under the table when no one was particularly watching, though Clara was always watching. They moved into a house that Jonas had spent the better part of February repairing. It was a 2-room house on the north edge of town, wood frame on a stone foundation, which Jonas had reinforced, and he had rebuilt the porch and replaced the windows and replastered the interior walls over the course of 3 weeks while Myrtle watched the transformation with the particular delight of a person seeing something become what it should be. She hung curtains on the new windows. She put the cherry wood box on the shelf above the fireplace. She planted kitchen herbs along the south-facing wall in the first week of April when the ground was warm enough. Jonas opened the carpentry shop in April as well, and it was, from the start, not a failure. Word moved through the network of homesteaders and ranchers and town residents the way it moved in frontier communities, through practical recommendation and the specific testimony of people who had seen the work and could vouch for it. By the end of the first month, he had a chair order and a door order and a new barn commission from a family called Whitcomb whose place was 12 miles north. He worked hard. He had always worked hard. It was not new to him, but there was a quality to it now that was different from what it had been before, a direction to it, a sense that the work was building towards something rather than simply sustaining him from one place to the next. He came home in the evenings to a house that was alive, to Myrtle's voice and the smell of cooking and the warm, specific weight of a life that was his. And he found that he was grateful in a way that he had not known to be grateful before because he had not known what he was missing. Myrtle continued to help Clara at the hotel on weekday mornings because she liked the work and because Clara actually needed the help and because she was not the kind of person who could sit at home waiting for things to happen when there was useful work in front of her. The arrangement suited everyone. She was home by early afternoon, and she had developed a genuine affection for the management of the hotel, the particular satisfaction of keeping a complex system running well, and she and Clara had settled into the friendship of two women who respected each other's competence and did not waste time on things that were not real. She was happy. She noticed herself being happy in the way that you notice it when it is new, when you are still a little surprised by it. She would be doing something ordinary, carrying water or kneading bread or walking to the hotel in the morning air, and she would become aware of a quality in her own chest that was like a lamp with good oil in it, burning clean and steady. One evening in late May, Jonas was working at the kitchen table on a small decorative piece he was making as a gift for the Whitcomb family, a carved frame for a looking glass, and Myrtle was mending near the window with the evening light still gold and long. The house was quiet except for the sound of his tools and the occasional voice from the street. She looked at him, and he looked up and caught her looking, and he said, "What?" "I was just looking," she said. "What are you looking at?" he said. "You," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth turned up in the way it did, that small, genuine movement. "Come here," he said. She set down her mending and went and sat beside him at the table, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and looked at the carved frame he had been working on, the thin, careful lines of leaves and grain. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is coming along," he said, which was how he spoke about his work. She turned her face into his shoulder. "Jonas," she said, "yes, I want you to know something." "What?" "I would choose this again," she said. "Every day I would choose this again." He was quiet for a moment, and then he pressed his lips to the top of her head and held them there. "So would I," he said. Summer arrived in full force, the particular Kansas summer that was not gentle about being summer, the sun hammer-flat against the open land and the heat in the afternoons enough to make the air visible above the packed dirt of the main street. The carpentry shop was warm by 10 in the morning and suffocating by 2, and Jonas had devised a system of opening panels in the rear wall to draw the air through, which helped in the evenings and not at all in the afternoons. He hired a boy named Samuel to help with rough work and deliveries, a 16-year-old who was quick and willing and who had, Jonas told Myrtle, a natural eye for the wood, the ability to look at a board and understand its grain, and Jonas was teaching him the way his father had taught him, which was to say rigorously and without shortcut. "You are good with him," Myrtle said one evening after Samuel had gone home, and she had stopped by the shop on her way back from the hotel and watched Jonas show the boy how to read the grain correctly. "He works," Jonas said, which was his highest compliment. She told him her news at the end of June. She told him in the evening in the kitchen after supper when she had confirmed it with enough certainty to be sure. She sat across from him at the table and said it plainly, because plain was how they spoke to each other, how they had always spoken. "I am expecting," she said. The expression on his face moved through several things very quickly. Shock, then the slow rising of something that was not quite a smile but was larger than a smile, a whole-face thing that she had never seen on him before and that she stored away in the part of her memory that kept the things she intended to carry forever. He reached across the table and took her hands. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am perfectly well," she said. "You are certain about the timing?" "February," she said. He looked at her hands in his and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up. "I am going to deserve this," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this asks of me, I am going to meet it." She felt the words settle into her. She had not known she needed to hear that particular thing until she heard it, and then it was obvious that she had been waiting for it, that it was the thing that made everything fully real. "I know you will," she said. "That is not something I have worried about for a single day." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there. The news moved through Colton the way all news did, in a widening circle. Clara Voss received it with the expression of a woman who has invested significantly in a venture and is now watching it pay off. Myrtle Leland came to the house and sat with Myrtle for an hour and talked about her own first pregnancy, which she had never done before, and Myrtle discovered that her aunt was more complicated and more tender than the practical surface of her had ever suggested. The summer had one more thing to offer before it was done, and it was not entirely pleasant. Sila's cutter came to the carpentry shop in August with what began as a commission. He wanted a set of cabinets for the main house on his ranch, solid work, nothing decorative, and he came to Jonas because he had heard about the grain storage building and the Whitcomb barn, and because whatever else he was, Cutter was a man who recognized quality when it was pointed out to him clearly enough. Jonas heard him out and gave him a price, and Cutter accepted it without bargaining, which told Jonas that the price was fair. But before he left, Cutter looked around the shop for a moment and then said, in the measured tone of a man who has something to say and has decided to say it, "You have built something here." "We have built something here," Jonas said. Cutter was quiet for a moment. "She chose well," he said, and it was not an easy thing for him to say. Anyone could see that. It was the statement of a man who had been revised by reality and was being honest about it, and Jonas gave him the courtesy of receiving it without triumph. "I intend to keep deserving it," Jonas said. Something passed between them that was not warmth exactly, but was the functional equivalent of acknowledgement between two men who occupied the same territory and had worked out the terms of doing so. Cutter left and Jonas went back to his work, and in the evening he told Myrtle, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good," in a way that closed the subject cleanly. The cabinet commission turned out to be a significant piece of work, and one of the finest things Jonas made in that period. It took 6 weeks and stretched into September, and when it was done and installed in the Cutter ranch house, Cutter stood in his kitchen and ran his hand along the fitted drawers and said nothing for a full minute, and then said that he would tell people about the shop. He was a man of considerable influence in the county and his word carried weight, and he did tell people, and the autumn of 1879 was the busiest Jonas had been since opening. October was golden, the same quality of amber light that had been present during their first walks by the creek a year ago now, and Myrtle, who was visibly pregnant and entirely unbothered by it in the way of a woman who had made her peace with her circumstances, walked the autumn streets of Colton with the proprietorial ease of someone who had chosen a place and had it choose her back. Clara insisted on reducing her hours at the hotel, not eliminating them but reducing them, and they had a firm disagreement about this that Myrtle eventually conceded because Clara's argument was the stronger one, and Myrtle had always been able to recognize a stronger argument. She spent more time at home. She cooked more extensively, which she liked. She organized the second room of the house into a suitable space for a child, with Jonas building a cradle from cherry wood in the evenings, working on it piece by piece, with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. She watched him make the cradle and thought about his father, who had been a builder and not a good man. And she thought about how Jonas had chosen to take the thing that was worth taking from that inheritance and leave the rest. And she thought that this was one of the harder and quieter kinds of courage, the kind that did not announce itself but was visible in what a person made over the course of years. "It is perfect," she said when he showed her the finished cradle sitting in the lamplight of the second room, its lines clean and solid, the wood warm and smooth. "The rockers are well balanced," he said. "I checked them a dozen times." "Of course you did," she said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked at the cradle and then at her. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, which was how they always did things with each other. "A little," she said, "but not of the things I thought I would be frightened of." "What does that mean?" he asked. "I thought I would be frightened of the unknowing," she said. "Of everything I cannot predict, but I find I am not particularly. I am more frightened of small things. Of not being able to give him what he needs." "Him," Jonas said. She smiled. "I feel it," she said. "I could be wrong." "You are not often wrong," he said. She was not wrong. Thomas Hayes was born on the 12th of February, 1880, in the bedroom of the house on the north edge of Colton, in a snowstorm that had come in overnight and made the world outside the windows white and muffled and still. Clara Voss served as midwife, because Clara had done this before and was sensible in a crisis, and Jonas was in the front room trying not to pace a groove in the floor. When Clara came to the door and said, "Come in now," Jonas went through, and Myrtle was sitting up in the bed with the most exhausted and determined expression he had ever seen on a human face, and in her arms was Thomas. Jonas stood in the doorway. "Come here," Myrtle said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held Thomas with the careful precision of a man who was very aware of what he was holding and the responsibility of it. And he looked down at his son and was so entirely still that it was almost frightening. And then he exhaled a long, slow breath and looked at Myrtle. His eyes were wet. "Hello," he said very quietly to Thomas. Myrtle put her hand on his arm. "I told you," she said. "You did," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at Thomas too. And outside the snow came down on Colton, Kansas, on the winter of 1880, and the house was warm. The years that followed were not simple, and they were not perfect, because no life is, but they were good in the way that things are good when they have been built with care from honest materials. The carpentry shop grew, slowly and steadily, the way Jonas did everything. He hired Samuel full-time when the boy turned 18, and Samuel had by then grown into a young man of genuine skill who was beginning to develop his own particular voice in the wood. Jonas and Myrtle had between them a deep and unspoken pride in watching that happen. The town of Colton grew too, the way the Kansas territory was growing, with new families coming out from the east and from Missouri and from further afield, drawn by the land and the possibility of something built from the beginning. The hotel added a wing under Clara's supervision, and Myrtle was part of the planning and management of that expansion, working in the mornings while Jonas's mother, who had come from Texas after a letter from Jonas, described what he had built in Kansas, watched Thomas, and later helped with the second child, a daughter born in the spring of 1882 whom they named Leland, after the aunt who had told a young woman with 2 weeks and no plan that she would be all right. The real Myrtle Leland cried when she heard the name, which was only the second time Myrtle had ever seen her aunt cry, and then she straightened her coat and said that the child had better have a strong constitution, given the name she was carrying. "She will," Myrtle said. She did. Jonas Hayes was from her first weeks a person of decided opinions, who made her preferences known without equivocation, and who had, by the time she was old enough to walk, a quality of certainty that made every adult in the house simultaneously delighted and exhausted. Thomas, 3 years ahead of his sister, had his father's quality of stillness and his mother's capacity for directness, and the two of them together in the world were a combination that Jonas and Myrtle navigated with the flexibility and humor that good parents develop over time, learning the specific grammar of their children the way you learn the specific grammar of the people you love. 5 years after the wedding, in the spring of 1884, Jonas paid the final installment on the carpentry shop building. He came home with the deed in his hand and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it, and Myrtle came and stood beside him. "That is ours," she said. "That is ours," he said. She put her arm through his and leaned against him, and they looked at the paper together in the afternoon light of a Kansas spring. And outside the window the new season was coming in with its full and ordinary extravagance, the green coming back into the land, the sky that high impossible blue. He turned to look at her. She had not changed in the way that people sometimes said that time did not change the people they loved, because that was never true, and he was not the kind of man who told pleasant untruths. She had changed. She was 29 now, and she wore her years in the specific ways that a woman did when she had worked hard and loved hard and been present for her life, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been in October of 1878. Not in spite of this, but because of it, because every year he had watched her become more fully and precisely herself. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking about the day you turned down Sela's cutter," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "Why?" "Because I have thought about it a lot over the years," he said, "about what it took to do that. You had nothing and you chose nothing rather than a safe something that was wrong, and then you made something. That is not a small thing, Myrtle." She looked at him for a moment. "And I am thinking about what you said that January night," she said, "about intending to deserve it." "I have tried," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been watching." He smiled, that real quiet smile, and she put her hand against his jaw. "You have succeeded," she said, "if you were wondering." "I was not going to ask," he said. "I know you weren't," she said. "That is why I told you." He covered her hand with his and turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. And she stood in her kitchen in the house that had been made by two people who had not been afraid to choose something real over something safe. And she was entirely, unreservedly content. Clara Voss came to supper that Friday, as she did most Fridays, and sat at the table that Jonas had made from walnut with the legs turned on a lathe he had built himself, and ate the meal that Myrtle had cooked and played a brief and spirited game with Thomas, involving cards that Clara claimed to have invented, and Thomas was fairly certain she was making up the rules of as she went, and held Elena on her knee, and told her a story about a woman who had come to Kansas with nothing but the money from an insurance policy, and had decided to build a hotel, which Elena always listened to with the attention of someone filing information for future use. "You are a corrupting influence," Myrtle told Clara after the children were in bed. "I'm a formative influence," Clara corrected. "There is a distinction." Jonas poured coffee and they sat at the table and talked the way old friends did, about things that mattered and things that did not, about the town and the territory and what was coming and what had already been. The evening light moved across the walnut table and settled into its grain and was absorbed by it, golden and complete. When Clara left, Myrtle stood at the door and watched her walk down the street toward the hotel, upright and purposeful as she always was, the woman who had taught her that you could build something from nothing if you were willing to be stubborn about it. She came back inside and found Jonas at the kitchen table with Thomas's writing exercises spread in front of him, looking at them with that focused, quiet attention he brought to everything. "He is improving," Jonas said, without looking up. "He is," she said, looking over his shoulder. "He got the loops from you." "My loops are not particularly distinguished," Jonas said. "They are very distinguished," she said. "They are the most distinguished loops I have ever seen." He looked up at her. "You are being ridiculous," he said. "I am being accurate," she said. He reached back and caught her hand without looking, and she let him hold it, and they stood there for a moment, in the ordinary and irreplaceable specific warmth of a life that had been chosen, deliberately, against the available alternatives, by two people who had decided that the thing they wanted was worth the risk of wanting it. The night settled over Colton, Kansas, over the spring of 1884, over the house on the north edge of town, where a carpenter and his wife had made something that neither of them could have made alone. And the sound of the children breathing in the next room was the sound of the future. And the lamp on the table made the walnut glow. And outside, the great Kansas sky was full of stars that had been there long before anyone had thought to settle this land and would be there long after. Indifferent and magnificent and present, Myrtle thought sometimes about what she had been offered, the arranged life, the St. Louis drawing rooms, the sensible futures. She thought about them without bitterness and without the particular self-satisfaction of someone who needs to be constantly right, because she was not that, she never had been. She thought about them the way you thought about roads you had not taken, with simple clarity, the understanding that they led somewhere else, and somewhere else was not here, and here was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been given a choice between safety and the man she wanted. She had chosen the man. And he had spent every day since then making himself worthy of it, not because she required it, not as a performance or a debt, but because that was who he was, because a man who understood the value of what he had been given did not take it for granted. And Jonas Hayes understood value the way he understood wood, completely and in the bone. She blew out the lamp and took his hand in the dark and led them both to bed, and the house breathed around them. And Thomas turned over in his sleep in the next room, and Alina murmured something in a dream, and the stars continued outside above the Kansas plain, and Myrtle Leland Hayes lay in the dark beside the man she had chosen, and felt the whole weight of her chosen life around her, solid and true and entirely her own. The morning that came next was ordinary in every important way. Jonas was up before the light, as he always was, starting the fire in the kitchen stove, while the dark was still pressed against the windows. Myrtle heard him moving through the house with that particular consideration he always showed in the early hours, the soft closing of doors, the careful placing of each step. She lay for a moment in the warm dark and listened to the sound of him, and felt the simple, unalloyed luxury of that, of having someone to listen to, someone whose ordinary daily sounds were the sounds that meant home. She got up. She padded into the kitchen where he was standing at the stove with his back to her, his hair still unruly from sleep, and she went and stood behind him and put her arms around him, and he covered her arms with his, and they stood that way in the early dark of a spring morning in 1884 while the coffee pot began to rattle on the hot iron. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said into his shoulder. Outside, a rooster in someone's yard announced the day with complete confidence, and the light began, slowly and then all at once, to come.